Welcome, it's Mark Bylock. I am a whiskey author, podcaster, and writer, reviewer, award taste judger. I don't know if I'm all those things. Welcome to my YouTube channel. It's been a minute. I think that's what kids say these days when they've been away for a long while. I've been gone. It's actually been 2 years, maybe 3. It's been a while. COVID. You know what? I know I don't like, my hair's terrible. I haven't shaved in a while. Part of the reason I've been so delayed in producing any content is, I'll get a haircut next week and I'll start producing some content. And next week comes along and get a haircut, and then I'm a little busy for a week, and then the children get sick, and then I get sick, and then we're sick for 6 weeks, and this just keeps happening and happening. Today, I set it up for the video and I had my trusted whisky.buzz glass ready to go, and I knock over the glass and it falls and smashes, which is really hard to smash these glasses because normally they land on the bottom, on the base. This one did not. It made a giant mess on my floor. Anyway, I got mad at TikTok. I know it's a shocking thing to say, but I'm mad at TikTok. There's a whiskey guy on TikTok that's an American bourbon drinker, has a lot of opinions about Canadian whiskey. Actually, very few opinions, mostly that it sucks. And I gotta say, that's not a bad opinion to have, especially if you live in America, because if you want your high oaky bourbons and ryes, there's not that many examples of really good oaky whiskeys, Canadian whiskeys in the United States of America. That's changing. It is changing. But I wanted to talk about one of the cool things that Canadian whiskey can do that American whiskey can't do. If you know anything about whiskey, you're going to say, the 909 rule where you can put 9% of something in their whiskey. And that's true. But that's not what we're going to talk about here. We are going to talk about my mostly finished bottle of... This is ever gonna, you know what? They shouldn't make clear bottles. It just messes. It's just not going to. We're gonna talk about Bareface Whiskey, a Canadian brand that is interesting. They don't have a distillery. They're owned by Mark Anthony's, who's a giant wine producer in the US. And they also own some wineries in BC. They have a very good oak program because winery. Mark Anthony's big group, so there's some money behind that. They started off by buying aged whiskeys from another Canadian producer or a few Canadian producers, and now they just buy distillant. So they just buy White Dog off the still, and then they age it. Now, the company's only been around for several years now, I guess, 4 or 5 years. So they're still aging some of that stuff. But today's whiskey is definitely different than it was a little while ago. Bareface has this unique idea of taking Canadian rules and really taking advantage of them. And by taking advantage of them in a fun, artisanal way. There's the 909 rule, which says you can pour wine or sherry or some younger whiskey into any bottle of Canadian whiskey. This stems from the 19th century when whiskey makers were allowed to blend 1 barrel of wine or something else fermented for every 10 barrels of whiskey. And that made sense because back then they didn't really age whiskey in oak for long periods of time. So the additive there was to make it palatable. The thing is, sherry's really expensive. So is wine. When the Scotch and mature things in sherry finishes, they take the barrels, the sherry's already gone. From my understanding, from what I know, the few producers that do add sherry add maybe 1.5%. And you're gonna be like, American whiskey is pure. It's not really. Straight bourbons and straight ryes are 100%. No coloring, fantastic whiskeys. But the broad whiskey category has things like non-whiskey flavoring, where people go in and actually create flavor profiles for rye, for example, and add that. And they can add up to 2.5% of those kind of flavors, which is actually quite cheaper, right? Because you're producing something in the lab, mass producing it and adding it to the bottle, and it's pretty cheap. But Bareface has done a few good things. The first release that they had, and their consistent releases, meant as a bartender's kind of mix your cocktails with, sip whiskey with, a kind of Canadian whiskey profile. But then they released one a couple of years ago, before COVID, where it had some mezcal in it. Canadian whiskey, a little bit of mezcal. It was really good. It was terrific. It was confusing. It was very confusing on the palate, but quite good. This is something different, and this is going to be part of a series. It is the Wilderness series, Bareface Whiskey. And what they did here is use mushrooms. Not shrooms, but they did use mushrooms as an additive to the flavor profile. Now you're going to say, that's weird. It is odd. But the mushrooms have all been foraged in the mountains of BC somewhere. I've told the whole story. It sounds amazing. They basically stoked the mushrooms in barrels with whiskey in it to kind of extract that flavoring. And then they used that to blend with a bunch of other barrels that all had Canadian whiskey in it. And they used a couple different barrel types to comb in the flavor profile. Now, I like Bareface a lot. They're not a typical whiskey, but they don't taste that atypical. You're going through this like mezcal, now they're doing mushrooms. What does that mean for the flavor profile? But really what they're going for is that umami kind of flavor note. Now, umami is kind of a weird flavor. It basically means like earthy, complicated, complex. That flavor profile you can't quite identify, but just gives it an extra a little bit of texture. And I would say they've succeeded. Now, if you're bothered that mushrooms have briefly been soaked in barrels and that was used to make this whiskey, that's fair. I get what you're saying. If you can look past that and just enjoy it for what it is, I think it's an excellent pour of whiskey. Now, I mentioned it doesn't smell a lot like mushrooms. It doesn't smell like mushrooms at all. In fact, I think it's where Bareface has an interesting kind of gimmick. The gimmick is that their name, Bareface, is in your face, gimmicky, Bareface, Canadian wilderness. Like, it's got that kind of gimmick to it. Mushrooms and then previously mezcal in a whiskey, a little bit gimmicky. It's there to get you through the door. It's like getting a book. Let's say you're buying a sci-fi or a romance or a fantasy book, and you look at that cover, and that cover's really interesting. And you know the cover's a gimmick. Yeah, you know it's a gimmick. You know that no matter how interesting that cover is, that means nothing about the book inside. And yet you'll buy the book. And that's what Bareface, in my mind, is going for. They want to get you through. They absolutely are honest with everything they do, so they'll tell you exactly how they made the whiskey. There's no sort of slyness about what they're doing. And then they just want you to taste the whiskey. And I think from that perspective, from a larger consumer base, that's great. They got the unique bottle with the zigzag lines, and they make a really delicious whiskey. So this is very much Canadian whiskey, but very forward. So you're going to get that kind of oaky char note that's very common. This does have some European oak in it as well. A bit of spice, and this is where it gets a little atypical. That umami, that earthiness, that kind of. I think if it wasn't for the kind of subtle mushroom note to it, I say a mushroom note, but it doesn't, again, smell like mushrooms. I would say that's where you would normally get the dark chocolate note, and it's not that that dark chocolate note is missing. And instead, you're getting this kind of deeper note. It's not quite varnish. It's not quite red apple. It's not quite the other notes you would know, but it's not unfamiliar. It's just, it has that little something different on the nose. Very spicy, lots of peppery spice. I would say it's on the paprika side, makes you a little hot in the cheeks. And that's my first drink of the day, so that also helps. There's that little bit of chocolate note, a little bit of that earthy note. You know what, this is a really great whiskey. It's probably about sold out, at least in Ontario. But it wasn't so much, I just wanted to talk about the Canadian whiskey category and what it allows. And I would say that most producers for the longest time have been making very affordable whiskeys that have had interesting shortcuts in the way they've been made to give you an affordable whiskey. But that's not where Canadian whiskey competes, because we all know the American whiskey category is the most affordable whiskey category. You can buy whiskey for $12 in the US. You can't do that in Canada. Canadian whiskeys are taxed higher. There's just a whole bunch of other reasons why we can't get that low in the price point. The whole point is to give you a delicious whiskey for a price point. And I would say Bareface is an example of somebody that's really pushing that category further. They're not the only ones, but they're definitely an interesting brand. Yeah, I don't know if I got mad at TikTok and I talk about it. Also, if you happen to know who I am, which is great. Yeah, it's been a minute since I've talked about whiskey. I did a lot of talks, a lot of whiskey tastings for companies, especially in Toronto, but I know a lot of consultative work with distilleries. All that dropped out of the hat when COVID happened, so I didn't have a lot of income coming through with whiskey, and it made it a little hard. Not financial necessarily, but just it made it hard to justify being away from the family. The kids are 5 now. They're wonderful, and I'm getting to know them, and they're getting to know me, and as they grow up. So it's changed. My life has changed a little bit, but I'm hoping this isn't going to be my first video in a while. In fact, I'll never post this unless there's a second video coming up. So subscribe to the channel, and that'll be coming in soon. Cheers.